And now we're continuing the day with the spotlight session focused on using planetary forensics to support food security and agricultural management with Dr. Joe Mascaro, who is the Director of Science and Strategy and Programs at Planet Labs. Joe?
I'm not a crop scientist. This is my domain of science, the jungle. And this is a photo from southern Peru. It's an area experiencing extensive deforestation. And I worked in academia for more than a decade to understand how we could measure things in the field and learn about the patterns of life on the earth. But I ran into, like I think a lot of people in the room, the problem of scale. And even this one fig tree turns out to be quite difficult to measure. Could take you a few hours, actually, to get a good diameter estimate from this guy. And when I came to Planet Labs almost a decade ago, I saw this. This is an island in the Panama Canal Zone called Barro Colorado Island. The yellow dots are guayacanas trees, individual trees, and they're in a state of flowering. During the dry season there, they turn yellow sometimes for maybe a week, but the combination of high frequency and high spatial resolution allowed Planet uniquely to see this phenomenon, which really hadn't been seen before. So I'm so excited to be here. I first want to thank Chris, John, Marie from AGS, as well as Chancellor Kristen Sobolik, who I learned from yesterday. She and I were influenced a little bit by a particular scientist, Margaret Davis, a palynologist, that I was studying as an ecologist. And I also want to thank Nicole, who many of you have met, who's running around doing a lot of organizational things today, and our various sponsors. But I want to talk to you about planetary forensics and how we can kind of cross the Rubicon of this difficult, necessary field work that almost all of us are doing into an operational Earth data platform that can help us make decisions as a community about things as big as climate change. The first thing we really need to do is measure. And good news, we're doing that. In an unprecedented way. The thing on the left is the classic Keeling curve, the increase in carbon dioxide. The graph on the right is the long-term trend in the deployment of Earth observation satellites. Observational data from space is only one dimension of the new network of sensors that we've been able to deploy as a society, as a global society. There are a lot of other dimensions to it. Planet is a participant in this deployment. We have a constellation of over 220 CubeSats, about the size of a loaf of bread. They're the very satellites that took that picture of the flowering trees in Panama, which I find amazing, a satellite you could hold in your hand. We also have a high-resolution constellation called SkySat, and future constellations in hyperspectral called Tanager, and an additional high-resolution constellation called Pelican, slated for deployment later this year. But this constellation sits within a much broader context of space operations, of public sensors that we all, I think, in this room have been using for decades in some cases. There's a huge NASA operational fleet. There's an enormous fleet of Earth observation sensors from the European Space Agency. And then much closer to the ground, there's a whole new diversity of sensors that we can deploy on the ground. Sometimes we call these proximate sensing devices. I think it's of interest, actually, that they, like our eyeballs, are sensing devices, that none of these data sets actually provide us with truth with a capital T. But they do give us a landscape of different sensor observations on the patterns that we're looking at in the world. And, you know, it maybe seems a little bit outside, but we're also, of course, pointing those kinds of sensors at the stars. This is the European Space Agency Gaia mission. I think appropriately named, like Lovelock's Gaia hypothesis of circa 50 years ago, which suggested at the time that the whole planet may be functioning as essentially one large organism. There are a lot of biological challenges with this theory, many of which have been addressed over decades. But recently, David Grinspoon is among several people that have noted that it's pretty clear now that we are essentially constructing a Gaia-like organism of the planet. When you start thinking about building these and interacting these monitoring tools together and making global decisions about how to drive policy related to carbon dioxide emissions or methane emissions or agricultural practices, and the level to which those filter down granularly into local communities like the one right here in the St. Louis region, it's pretty clear that we're probably on the cusp of something like building a Gaia, a kind of operational Gaia. As Director of Science Strategy and Programs at Planet, I'm very focused on scientific discovery. That's my remit at Planet, and it's one of the reasons I'm here at UMSL. This is a lab actually down the road at St. Louis University, but I think it serves as a good proxy for a typical remote sensing science laboratory anywhere in the world. It's a part of the process that if you're in commercial industry, if you're at the NGA, is sometimes difficult to see if you haven't personally been there, which is why I'm so excited to yesterday, for example, see the Globe building, where students and faculty members are having increasing opportunities to be in extremely close proximity to industry and create spaces like this that are almost hybrids of the academic discovery laboratory, where ideas would be created in a kind of ivory tower, but have them be created in proximity to actors in industry who are going to filter down and make decisions. I want to run through and just very quickly a real survey of some of these kinds of examples. The first one I want to show you, actually, sorry, one more slide. This is the broader context for how Planet is working with these types of centers of excellence. The TGI that Vasset just described to you, headquartered at St. Louis University and with the constellation of partners here in the St. Louis area, is the largest currently of Planet's partners of academic network around the world across more than 150 institutions with more than 20,000 users in different countries. But let's take a look at what kinds of discoveries these folks are making. And bear in mind, these are the kinds of discoveries that are happening usually without the pressure of generating commercial products or business opportunities. Sometimes they're happening accidentally, as science often happens. Sometimes people are innovating something that they thought would solve problem A, and it turns out to be astonishingly useful for problem B, which turns out to also be pretty much how all technology is created. So I mentioned these flowering trees in Panama, and you might think right away that doesn't have a lot to do with agricultural science. It turns out it does. The methods being used by different labs, one at a university in Australia, a university in Belgium, a university in California, are looking at the timing of the phenology of the vegetation, and in the case in California, using it to understand almond yields. The timing and strength of flowering events, just like the ones we saw in Panama, are, it turns out, beautifully correlated with almond yields. And overall, these patterns allow, in the Belgian case, for example, the ability to discriminate between individual canopy tree species, sometimes at the species level, sometimes at the genus level. The method behind this is very similar to using spectral temporal changes over time to discriminate between different types of crops. People working on air quality modeling at a university, actually Duke University, a Swedish university, there's a similarity here right away. Intersecting multiple data layers in different dimensions, much in the way that Abby showed you this morning, and building a spatial modeling stack where you can essentially build a decision-making tool that derives from a series of input data sets, right? And really the science of it is figuring out how to get those input data sets to talk to each other so that at the end, you end up with an air quality monitoring tool that could tell you what estimated PM 2.5 is in the atmosphere at a particular place on a particular day. So the others I'm going to run through a little more quickly. This is water turbidity, I think critical to this audience due to the influence of effluent from agricultural practices. We can now measure with satellites the suspended sediment loads in harbors. This one on the right is from Venice Harbor during the COVID lockdown. So of the insert on the right there, the half on the left that looks yellow and red is typical Venice water turbidity. The stuff on the right is during the lockdowns when boat traffic was eliminated. Patterns of life, I won't go through all of these, but one that deals with agricultural practices is this one in the center that looks at the behavior of pop-up markets, again, as they were affected by the lockdown. So this is sort of a supply chain pattern of life monitoring capability. Again, built in a research lab, not ready for prime time, if you will, sort of early work, but promising work that allows us to think about how we might integrate this type of product with agricultural data sets. And looking at the vegetation, which I think is a more obvious focus of our talk today. I want to actually jump ahead and dive into one of these vegetation case studies because I think it reveals how discovery plays such an important role in what we're building together as a community. When Planet first launched its CubeSats, they had a very good radiometric quality, but not nearly as good as it is today. And one of the things that agricultural scientists, in this case in King Abdullah University of Science and Technology in Saudi Arabia, looked at the intersection of Planet data with public sensor data sets in order to understand this radiometric variation from multiple observations. And they were able to fuse those data sets together to essentially create a metadata set that reflected the trends of multiple different types of sensors. It's of interest to me in the discovery context because they might not have had to do this if Planet data already resembled Sentinel-2, for example, in its radiometric characteristics, which today it does because we've been improving the hardware. So when they were faced with this challenge, here's the radiometric look. I won't go through all the details, but the older and now entirely deorbited Dove Classics, or deprecated, they're some still in space, but they're no longer providing products, have those 4 spectral channel spectral response functions that you see in the middle. And you can tell, those of you that have a remote sensing background, those are not ideal. All of the Doves in space operating now and producing our operational products going into our customers are the SuperDove in 8 spectral bands, and you can see how we've altered those spectral configurations to align them more with this public sensor data set. This was an insight that was driven by customer requests, but also community consensus around how to improve the hardware. And the agricultural innovation that I noticed there was just showing you was that these scientists essentially built an algorithm to allow you to align all of these data sets to one common radiometric standard. This is incredibly powerful because it shows us how we as a diverse community of academics, of commercial actors, can begin to build consensus around truly what is the state of the Earth. And I don't mean truth with a capital T. I mean, this is the best state that we know the Earth. Here's our accuracy assessment today, and let's work as a community to iterate and eventually crush down that accuracy. This is a short example of how this fusion algorithm works. If you think of this Jenga tower as occupying a single pixel on the Earth's surface at, say, one of those intersection points of a Jenga piece at the bottom on the surface of the Earth, and as you as a remote sensor, whether it's with satellite imagery or drone imagery, you're collecting observations that are focused on that particular space over time, you will never have a perfectly homogeneous, identical observation space. It's just the nature of remote sensing, orbital mechanics. What this algorithm does is take a look at the available observation and use statistical inference to try to fill in the gaps. An analogy would be if you're driving a modern car and it has a GPS and it has a speedometer and it has an accelerometer like your phone, and you're perhaps driving along the coast of California and you go into a deep tunnel and you lose the GPS signal. Does the car suddenly wonder if it's in South Korea? No. Why? Because those data sets have been modeled together so that the absence of one, like if you didn't have SAR imagery this day, or the absence of, oops, I didn't get to the field and collect my drone data this day, allows you to basically put those sensor consensus together in order to create a really clear and concise trend. This is really, really powerful. It underlies a lot of the work I'm going to briefly show you at larger scale once these kinds of tools have been deployed. Planet's engaged in building planetary variables, which are these higher order information layers, things like soil water content, land surface temperature, crop biomass, and a roads and buildings indicator. And although the widgets are different, to a degree, they all have some similar component of essentially vacuuming a lot of disparate information and trying to achieve a statistical consensus about what is the state of the world. And so as a result, when you add new stuff, like you set up a new field project and you're able to validate a particular component of your work at a particular site, this kind of information can be eventually in the aggregate incorporated into this product space. Here's an example, and back to what's close to my heart in forests. Through a recent acquisition of a company called Salo, Planet's now invested in building a forest carbon indicator layer. This one actually functions very similarly to our crop biomass information layer, in the sense that I suppose it runs on a similar sort of conceptual engine of how it's able, as I said, to consume a lot of this disparate sensor information, integrate it, produce a single standardized layer with some indication of accuracy. In agriculture, we've seen scientists across this large community deploy really fantastic insights into large-scale activities on the Earth's surface. This is a look at national-scale crop boundaries in Ghana. What's of interest here is that as a smallholder, primarily agricultural system, these data sets, this represents the, if you will, decomposition of hundreds of terabytes of information down to the best estimate of where the field boundaries of tiny tenth of a hectare or half-hectare smallholder agricultural fields would be. And like all of the studies I've shown you already, it relies not just on Planet data, but a lot of different remote sensing and sensor inputs. And similarly, and I think finally, if I've got my slide track right in my head, a look at the effects of the war in Ukraine. And here, using very similar methodology, ability to discriminate between different crops. This is work led by NASA Harvest through a partnership with Planet, such that, astonishingly, from space, the effect of the war on agricultural production is plainly visible. This white line represents the state of the front at the time that this data set was created. And what you can see is this kind of darkening of the crop layer around that line in Planet data. This is unharvested fields, fields where it was simply not possible to harvest because the conflict was so intense in those areas. Okay, so I'm out of time already, but I'm going to just give you one slide. I'm trying to put all of this together. Thanks, Nicole. I think that when we build community engagements like we're doing here today, it's important that we think about our own expertise in the context of the multidisciplinary nature of the expertise in this room. And I think that as we build the way, for example, Vasset was just showing us, these kinds of engines of discovery, it's important to remember how critical they are to have a space to allow that discovery to happen. And I think I'm so delighted to see UMSL deeply involved in creating the formation of that space in the context of these various commercial actors and other government actors in the region. Because what this means is that each person's specialty in these different steps that I showed you, and so far Abby's the only one I've seen that has a specialty across the whole thing here, what she showed you this morning, allows the kind of really deep technical scientific discovery to take place such that by the time we get to let's build a crop yield dashboard, we're able to pull in these multidisciplinary actors for consensus. I'm going to stop there and toggle to this ending slide. And thank you very much for your attention. Appreciate being here.
Thank you, Joe. We're very appreciative for the sponsorship of Planet.